and 9 years to win Dancer of the Year. It takes a long time. Outstanding technique, stage presence, poise, dedication, attends all kinds of functions, is a team player, and just loves dancing. There's a lot of things that go into thought with picking a Dancer of the Year. Some of these girls will tell you, how long did it take you guys to win Dancer of the Year? 6 years, 3 years, 4 years, 8 years. How many, Ruby? 8 years? Yeah, my daughter took 8 years to win. It takes a long time, a lot of dedication. There's lots of wonderful dancers. But this is a very prestigious award. The people that are coming up to get their awards, will you stay on stage when you get this award? Dancer of the Year, Rachel Nevels. Dancer of the Year, Lauren Grove. Dancer of the Year, Ingrid Knudsen. Dancer of the Year, Allie Griffith. Dancer of the Year, Melissa Greenwood. Dancer of the Year, Georgie Batsford. Dancer of the Year, Maya Morja. Dancer of the Year, Elizabeth Ellis. Dancer of the Year, Caitlin Sadler. Dancer of the Year, Sylvia Campany. Dancer of the Year, Olivia Buckley. Dancer of the Year, Amanda Gable. Dancer of the Year, Madeline Santamore. Dancer of the Year, Adelie Banger. Dancer of the Year, Rachel Sweeney. Dancer of the Year, Deja Braddock. Dancer of the Year, Caitlin Manning. Dancer of the Year, Kirsten Mosier. Dancer of the Year, Chantel Filiatro. Dancer of the Year, Jenna Greenwood. Dancer of the Year, Brianna Scott. Dancer of the Year, Maddie Scott. Dancer, yeah, those are different. Dancer of the Year, Faith Baker. Dancer of the Year, Patrick Reno. Dancer of the Year, Nick Spears. Dancer of the Year, Jacob Knudsen. Dancer of the Year, Joey Johnston. Dancer of the Year, Gregory Downey. Dancer of the Year, Matthew Manning. Couple more awards. Awards not chosen by me, but I agree totally. The photographer, Tony Urbaniak from Urbaniak Studios, has picked 2 winners for the most photogenic Miss Photogenic Award 2010. Rhiannon Berto and Miss Photogenic 2010, Bella Perigo. So if they're here, they can come up and get their awards. Rhiannon here and Bella. Okay. Okay. Congratulations, Rhiannon. We gave everybody in the dance studio an opportunity, students and parents, to choose the People's Choice winner. Who do you enjoy watching the most? Who do you just love to watch? People's Choice winner was a tie this year, a 2-way tie. I really almost think these girls might have tied last year. People's Choice winners, 2010, with equal votes, Lexi Hills and Reba Earle. Congratulations, ladies. I was just telling them how much they look like today here, too. But you two, come on out, but you two better watch out, because behind you, with 1 vote, come on over, Lexi, standing next to Reba. Second place People's Choice Award, right behind the two of you, is Madeline Santamore. Madeline here. Okay. Want to stand next to those 2 girls? Because you like got the same votes that they did, yeah. girls tied for second place, and I agreed so much that I figured that they all needed recognition. Tying for second place, congeniality means who's the kindest dancer, who's helpful to everybody. This is a beautiful word to have. I don't vote on this again. I don't vote on People's Choice, and I don't vote on photogenics. Second place, congeniality, goes to Stephanie Hall, Brittany Carpenter, and Abby Swanson. Is Abby Swanson still here? Oh, good. I'm glad you could stay. I know, Abby, I know you got to ski daddle, got to get your brother ready for the prom, but I was hoping you could stay to get this honor. Thank you. And our overall congeniality winner for 2010, many votes to Angelica Haney. I really think, I know everybody in your group voted for you because I know their handwriting. Yeah, okay, good job. Well, maybe not for Brittany. Brittany wants to know when we voted for congeniality. A couple more special awards. Teacher's Award. Teacher's Choice for the most athletic and most physically fit dancer. Very dedicated to fitness and athletics along with her dance goes to Chelsea Scott. When I was working late at night at the studio, I would see Chelsea running back and forth, back and forth. Teacher's Choice, Best Team Player. I've watched this girl all year long, being a great team player and supportive to all of her team. Goes to Hunter Zare. Congratulations, Hunter. Teacher's Choice, Most Dedicated Dancer. 24/7 dedicated. They're all dedicated, but this dancer has a special amount of dedication to dance, to technique. She's always pushing me to push her more toward learning. Abby Perkins. Teacher's Choice. This dancer is the most humble and respectful dancer. Always shows myself and all of her team respect. She's not here. She's showing her brother respect right now in the States for baseball. Goes to Sarah. Everybody knows it. Okay, so this is for Sarah Lou Hovenden. And last but certainly not least, Teacher's Choice. Every year I pick a high riser award. Somebody that I saw that rose from a level to an upper level of movement. Somebody who really gave a lot of dedication and concentration and willingness to learn. Natalie Weissenberger, High Riser Award winner 2010.